Enjoy your dirt, Helen, my daughter-in-law said with a smile as the lawyer slid the final document across the mahogany table. George clearly knew which family members deserved the real assets. My son Ryan let out a quiet laugh beside her, not cruel enough to sound shocking to anyone else in the room, but enough to make something cold settle deep inside my chest. I looked down at the papers in front of me. One desert property in Arizona. 40 acres of dry land outside a town I'd never even heard of. No lake house. No investment portfolio. No vacation condo in Florida. Those went to Ryan and Vanessa. My husband of 42 years had been dead for 11 days. And somehow that hurt less than watching my own son avoid my eyes while his wife mocked me in the office where his father's life was being divided into neat little folders. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Outside the large windows, rain slid slowly down the glass in thin silver lines. Vanessa crossed her legs and adjusted the diamond bracelet Ryan bought her last Christmas. "What are you even supposed to do with dirt?" she asked lightly. "Plant potatoes?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was an older man named Harold Bennett, someone George had trusted for over 20 years. He cleared his throat softly and pushed another envelope toward me. "Mr. Whitmore asked that this be given to you personally, Mrs. Whitmore." Vanessa rolled her eyes before I could even touch it. "Probably instructions on where to find the tumbleweeds." Ryan muttered, "Vanessa," but there was no real warning in his voice. Just embarrassment that someone else might hear her. I picked up the envelope carefully. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that immediately. I thought they would after burying my husband less than 2 weeks earlier. But grief had changed shape inside me. It no longer felt loud. It felt heavy, quiet, like carrying wet sand in my chest. George always believed land mattered more than money. Even when we were young and struggling to pay our mortgage in Ohio, he used to stop the car whenever he saw open fields stretching beyond the highway. "People laugh at land," he'd say, "until one day they can't afford it anymore." Back then, I thought he was just dreaming out loud. Vanessa stood up first when the meeting ended. "Well," she said brightly while slipping on her white designer coat, "I guess this worked out exactly the way it should have." Ryan followed her toward the door without looking back at me. For a second, I watched the same little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms disappear behind a woman who measured human worth by square footage and bank accounts. Harold waited until the door closed before speaking again. "Your husband made me promise not to interfere," he said quietly. "But Helen, George was very specific about that land." I looked down at the envelope resting in my lap. Suddenly it felt heavier than paper should feel. Outside, thunder rolled across the gray afternoon sky while I slowly opened the seal and unfolded the single handwritten note inside. The message was only 7 words long. "Trust the land, not the people around you." I did not open George's note again that night. I left it on the kitchen table beside his old reading glasses and stared at it while the grandfather clock ticked through the silence of the house we had shared for more than 4 decades. The rain had followed me home from the lawyer's office, tapping softly against the windows while the Ohio evening turned dark around me. Everything in the house still looked like George might walk back into it at any moment. His brown work jacket still hung beside the back door. His coffee mug sat upside down near the sink because I still could not bring myself to wash it. Even the faint smell of cedar and motor oil lingered in the garage from the weekends he spent fixing old tools that probably should have been thrown away years ago. I heated a bowl of soup I did not eat and sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the refrigerator hum. 11 days earlier, this house had been full of casseroles, sympathy flowers, and people speaking in soft voices. Now it was just me and the quiet. Ryan used to call every evening after his father died. Then Vanessa started answering his phone more often. Then the calls became shorter. By the second week, they stopped completely unless they needed something. Around 8:30 that night, my phone buzzed against the wooden table. "Vanessa." I let it ring twice before answering. "Helen," she said in that sugary voice she used whenever she wanted to sound caring. "Ryan and I were just talking about you." I looked across the dark kitchen toward the empty chair George always sat in. "That is nice," I said quietly. "We were thinking maybe this house is too much for you now." There it was. Not grief. Not concern. Business. I could almost picture her standing in their modern kitchen with granite countertops and expensive pendant lights, speaking while scrolling through real estate listings on her phone. "The stairs alone worry us," she continued smoothly. And winter is coming. Ryan said the driveway was hard enough for Dad to maintain even before. Her voice trailed off delicately around the word dead. I closed my eyes for a second. George used to shovel that driveway before sunrise every winter because he said he liked the silence before the neighborhood woke up. I am managing, I replied. Vanessa laughed softly. Of course you are. But maybe it is time to think about simplifying your life. There are beautiful senior communities outside Columbus. Some even have golf courses. I almost smiled at that. George hated golf. He said wandering across grass while wearing khakis sounded like punishment. I will think about it, I said. It was easier than fighting. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. And about that land in Arizona. Ryan said if you do not want to deal with selling it, we could help. Honestly, Helen, 40 acres of dirt in the middle of nowhere cannot be worth much. Her words settled strangely against the memory of George's note. Trust the land, not the people around you. I have not decided anything yet, I said carefully. There was a pause long enough for me to hear disappointment slip through her silence before she recovered. Well, do not wait too long. Property taxes add up fast. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. Then I finally unfolded George's note again beneath the yellow kitchen light. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Strong. Steady. Under the sentence was something I had not noticed before. Tiny numbers written in the bottom corner. Coordinates. I frowned and reached for George's old atlas from the shelf near the dining room. My fingers traced the faded maps until I found northern Arizona. The coordinates pointed somewhere outside a town called Red Mesa. Population barely over 2,000 people. Desert. Highways. Empty space stretching for miles. I stared at the map while the clock ticked louder and louder in the silence. Then another memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, George had returned from a solo trip, unusually quiet. I asked him where he had been, and he smiled in that distant way he sometimes had near the end. Just checking on something for the future, he said. I never asked what he meant. That night, for the first time since his funeral, I did not cry before bed. Instead, I pulled an old suitcase from the closet and placed it carefully on top of the blankets. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of wind brushing against the bedroom windows. For a moment, half asleep beneath the heavy quilt George and I bought during our anniversary trip to Vermont, I forgot he was gone. My hand reached across the mattress automatically, searching for the warmth that had been beside me every morning for 42 years. I found cold sheets instead. I lay there staring at the ceiling until the reality settled over me again like a heavy winter coat. Downstairs, the coffee maker gurgled softly while pale morning light crept across the kitchen floor. I stood at the counter wearing George's old flannel robe and studied the Arizona map spread across the table beside his handwritten note. Red Mesa. The name sounded dry and lonely. The kind of place people drove through without stopping. I traced the highway lines with my fingertip while memories of George kept surfacing in pieces I had ignored before. The unexplained trips. The late-night phone calls he always took outside. The stack of land survey magazines in the garage I once teased him about collecting like baseball cards. At the time, I thought it was another one of his harmless obsessions. Now I was no longer. Sure. Around 9 o'clock, headlights swept across the front window. Vanessa's white luxury SUV rolled into the driveway with perfect timing, like she had already decided my mornings belonged to her now. I barely had time to open the front door before she walked inside, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 expensive coffees and a tight smile. I brought caramel lattes, she announced brightly. I figured you probably have not been eating enough. She glanced around the kitchen quickly, the way real estate agents inspect homes before listing them. Her eyes lingered on the old oak cabinets George refused to replace because he built them himself 30 years ago. You really should think about updating this place if you plan to sell. I accepted the coffee without answering. Vanessa sat down at the table across from the Arizona map before I could fold it away. You are still looking at that land? She asked with a soft laugh. Helen, it is literally in the middle of nowhere. I noticed how quickly her expression sharpened when she saw George's handwritten coordinates beside the map. Not curiosity. Interest. Careful interest. Ryan mentioned you have been acting distant since the reading, she continued. He is worried about you. I almost smiled at that. Ryan had not called once. Vanessa stirred artificial sweetener into her coffee slowly. Honestly, if George wanted to take care of you, he should have left you something practical. Not desert dirt. Her words sounded casual, but underneath them I heard something else. Impatience. I folded the map carefully and slid it into the drawer beside me. Your husband believed the land mattered, I said quietly. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. George also thought people still paid with cash at gas stations. He was old-fashioned. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Perfect blonde hair. Cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Nails polished pale pink. Everything about her looked polished and expensive, but there was always a restlessness underneath. Like someone constantly calculating what every room might be worth. Ryan and I have actually been discussing options for your future, she said gently. There is a beautiful retirement community near Dayton. They have walking trails, movie nights, transportation services. She paused carefully before adding. And if you sold this house and that Arizona property, you could really live comfortably. There it was again. The land. Always returning to the land. I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup while my heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. George had known something. Maybe not just about Arizona. Maybe about them. Vanessa stood and smoothed her sweater before heading toward the door. Think about what I said, she called lightly. At your age, peace of mind matters more than hanging onto useless things. After she left, the silence inside the house felt different than before. Less lonely. Sharper somehow. I walked into the garage and stared at George's old green pickup truck sitting beneath years of dust and hanging tools. The keys still hung exactly where he always left them beside the workbench. I picked them up slowly. Then I opened the driver's side door and climbed inside. The cracked leather seat still smelled faintly like him. For the first time since his funeral, I felt something stronger than grief settle inside me. Not anger. Not fear. Purpose. By noon, I had booked a motel outside Amarillo, Texas. Arizona was nearly 1,800 miles away. And for reasons I could not fully explain yet, I knew I needed to see that land before anyone else did. The highway stretched endlessly beneath a pale gray sky as I crossed into Texas sometime after sunrise. George's old pickup truck rattled softly every time I drove over rough pavement, and the coffee in the cup holder had gone cold nearly an hour earlier, but I kept driving anyway. Mile after mile, the world outside my window flattened into open fields, faded billboards, and lonely gas stations sitting beneath giant American flags whipped hard by desert wind. Somewhere near Oklahoma City, I realized it was the first time in years I had gone anywhere without explaining myself to someone else first. No checking with Ryan. No adjusting plans around family dinners Vanessa controlled, like social events she hosted for important clients. Just me, the road, and George's strange final message sitting folded inside my purse. By late afternoon, the landscape began changing color. The trees thinned. The earth turned dusty and red. Even the air looked different somehow, sharper beneath the huge western sky. I stopped at a small diner outside Amarillo where faded country music played softly from an old jukebox near the counter. The waitress called everyone honey and kept refilling my coffee without asking. I sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth watching truckers move in and out beneath the neon lights while exhaustion settled into my bones. 70 years old in 2 months. And here I was driving across the country chasing a dead man's secret buried somewhere in Arizona dirt. Any sensible person would have turned around already. But George had never been careless with words, especially near the end. My phone buzzed just as I finished paying the check. Ryan. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Mom, he said immediately, sounding irritated instead of relieved. Where are you? I stepped outside into the dry evening wind. Traveling. There was silence on the line before he exhaled sharply. Vanessa said your truck is gone. Not your truck. Your father's truck. I needed some time away, I replied. You could have told us first, he said. In the background, I heard Vanessa's muffled voice asking something quickly. Ryan lowered his voice after that. Mom, are you going to Arizona? I stopped walking. Cars hissed past on the highway nearby, while the motel sign flickered red against the darkening sky. Why would you ask that? Another pause. Too long. Because Vanessa looked up the property online, he admitted carefully. Apparently, some development company bought land a few miles outside Red Mesa last year. My grip tightened around the phone. And maybe it would make more sense for all of us to handle this together. There it was again. Together. Funny how family only became a team when money might be involved. I am only going to look at it, I said quietly. Ryan sighed heavily like I was creating problems for him personally. Mom, you do not understand how these things work. Land deals, taxes, contracts. People take advantage of elderly women traveling alone. Elderly women. Not mother. Not Helen. Elderly women. I suddenly remembered teaching Ryan how to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot when he was 6 years old. He used to cry whenever he scraped his knee. Now he spoke to me like a liability that needed managing. I think I will survive one road trip, I said calmly. Vanessa's voice became louder in the background. Sharp. Fast. Ryan lowered the phone for a second before returning. Vanessa thinks you should wait until we can come with you. I looked out across the dark Texas highway stretching west toward Arizona. No, I said softly. I do not think so. Then I hung up before he could answer. That night, I checked into a roadside motel with flickering lights and thin curtains that smelled faintly like cigarette smoke from another decade. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the small map spread open beside George's note while trucks groaned past outside all night long. Somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond another day of driving, waited 40 acres of land everyone else seemed strangely nervous about. Around midnight, I finally noticed something written faintly beneath the coordinates on George's paper. So faded I almost missed it entirely. Ask for Walter. By the following afternoon, the Arizona state line appeared beneath a cloudless sky, so wide it almost made me dizzy. Heat shimmered above the highway in silver waves while red rock formations rose in the distance, like something ancient watching from another lifetime. George's truck groaned every time the road climbed uphill, but somehow it kept moving forward just like I did. Red Mesa turned out to be smaller than I imagined. One main road, a gas station, a diner with dusty windows, a hardware store with an old Coca-Cola sign hanging crooked above the entrance. It looked like the kind of town people forgot unless they were born there. I parked beside the diner and stepped out into dry desert heat that wrapped around me instantly. The air smelled like dust and gasoline. My knees ached from driving nearly 2,000 miles, but I stood there for a moment, staring at the town while wind pushed grit softly across the pavement. George had been here, maybe many times. The thought made me feel strangely close to him again. Inside the diner, ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, while a waitress refilled coffee cups for ranchers wearing faded denim and sunburned faces. Conversations drifted quietly through the room beneath old country songs playing from a radio near the kitchen. I slid into a booth near the window and unfolded George's note carefully beside my coffee cup. Ask for Walter. The waitress noticed the paper while pouring coffee. Walter Briggs? She asked casually. My head lifted immediately. You know him? She nodded toward the back corner of the diner. Hard not to. He practically lives here. I turned slowly and saw an older man sitting alone beneath a dusty window. Gray beard, weathered cowboy hat resting beside his plate. He looked somewhere in his late 70s, with the kind of deeply lined face built by decades under desert sun. He was studying me already, like he knew exactly why I had come. I carried my coffee over carefully. Are you Walter? He glanced down at George's note in my hand before answering. You must be Helen. My breath caught slightly. George talked about you, Walter said quietly. Said you were smarter than the rest of them put together. I sat down slowly across from him. Hearing George's name spoken by someone who knew him out here felt strangely emotional, like finding a missing piece of his life I never realized existed. Walter stirred sugar into his coffee slowly before speaking again. Your husband came through Red Mesa for almost 6 years, usually twice a year. I stared at him. 6 years. Walter nodded. He bought that land long before anyone around here cared about it. Outside the diner window, a freight train rolled slowly through town while heat shimmered above the tracks. Why? I asked softly. Walter looked toward the desert beyond the highway. Because George paid attention. He leaned back slightly in the booth. About 5 years ago, state surveyors started sniffing around this region. Quietly. New interstate expansion. Commercial routes. Energy companies. He tapped one rough finger against the table. Most folks ignored it. George did not. My chest tightened. Suddenly George's long, unexplained trips no longer felt mysterious. They felt deliberate. Planned. He believed the land would eventually become valuable, Walter continued. But that was not the real reason he held on to it. I frowned slightly. Then what was? Walter studied me carefully for several seconds before answering. Your husband knew your family would turn ugly after he died. The words settled heavily between us. I looked down at my untouched coffee. Walter sighed softly. George loved your son, but he worried about the woman your son married. A bitter little smile touched my mouth before disappearing again. You noticed that too? Walter chuckled quietly. Helen, half this town noticed once she started calling around asking questions about your land 2 days after George's obituary appeared online. I froze completely. Vanessa called here? Walter nodded once. Asked whether there were active buyers nearby. Asked if anyone had made offers recently. Sounded real interested for someone who thought the place was worthless. Heat flushed through me despite the air conditioning inside the diner. Suddenly, every conversation with Vanessa replayed differently inside my mind. The fake concern. The pressure to sell. The retirement community brochures. Walter reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded map marked with red circles and survey lines. Then he slid it slowly across the table toward me. You need to see what your husband was really protecting. I stared down at the map Walter had pushed across the diner table while my coffee slowly turned cold beside me. Red circles covered the area around George's property like warning signs. Survey lines stretched across the desert in thick black ink, and several sections were highlighted with handwritten notes I did not understand. Walter tapped one weathered finger near the center of the map. That is your land, he said quietly. 40 acres suddenly looked very small surrounded by all those markings. And this? I asked. Walter leaned back with a slow sigh. Lithium exploration zones. The word meant little to me at first. I frowned slightly while wind rattled the diner windows behind us. Walter must have noticed my confusion because he lowered his voice and explained patiently. Electric vehicle batteries. Energy storage. Companies are scrambling for land out here. He pointed toward another section circled in red. 2 major corporations have already bought property within 20 miles of yours. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. George knew. Somehow, years before anyone else cared, my husband had seen value hidden beneath empty desert dirt everyone else laughed at. I looked down at the faded note again. Trust the land, not the people around you. Suddenly the sentence no longer sounded poetic. It sounded like a warning. Walter folded his hands on the table. George figured the value would explode eventually. Maybe not overnight, but soon. I stared through the diner window toward the endless desert beyond town. Then why did he not tell Ryan? Walter gave me a sad look that answered the question before he even spoke. Because George was not worried about Ryan. Silence settled between us after that. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered softly while the smell of bacon drifted through the diner. Finally, Walter spoke again. Your husband thought Vanessa would push to sell fast once he died. Cheap. Quiet. Before you understood what you had. I closed my eyes briefly. Every conversation replayed differently now. The fake kindness. The pressure. The constant reminders about retirement communities and simplifying my life. None of it was about helping me. They wanted control before I could ask questions. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a business card worn soft around the edges. If companies start calling, talk to this lawyer first. Nobody else. The card read Daniel Mercer, Land and Mineral Rights Attorney, Phoenix, Arizona. George trusted him, Walter added. That is enough for me. Outside, afternoon sunlight burned white against the pavement as we walked toward the parking lot together. Walter stopped beside George's old truck and looked at it for a long moment. He loved this thing, he muttered with a faint smile. Drove it out here every spring. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I did not know. Walter rested one hand against the dusty truck bed. There was a lot George kept quiet near the end. He hesitated before adding, mostly because he was trying to protect you. My phone began vibrating inside my purse before I could answer. Vanessa. Again. I almost ignored it, but Walter nodded slightly toward the phone. Might be worth hearing what she says now. I answered carefully. Vanessa's voice sounded too cheerful immediately. Helen, where are you? Arizona. Silence. Then a quick inhale she failed to hide. Oh, wow. You actually drove all the way there. I leaned lightly against the truck door while desert wind pulled at my hair. Yes. Her tone softened artificially. Ryan and I have been worried sick. I looked out toward the empty highway stretching beyond town. That is thoughtful. Another pause. Then she lowered her voice slightly. Helen, before you make any decisions about the property, there are things you should understand. Taxes. Zoning laws. Buyers can take advantage of older women out there. Older women again. Always older women. Never me. Never Helen. I glanced at Walter standing quietly beside the truck, his lined face unreadable beneath the desert sun. I met someone who knew George, I said calmly. The silence on the other end became immediate and heavy. Oh, Vanessa replied carefully. Yes, I continued softly. Apparently George visited Red Mesa for years. Another silence. Longer this time. Then came the question she could not stop herself from asking. Did he mention anything about the land value? There it was. No pretending anymore. No concern about my safety. Just money finally stepping fully into the light. I smiled faintly without meaning to. No, I said quietly. But I think I am finally starting to understand why my husband trusted dirt more than people. Then I ended the call before she could answer. Walter offered to drive me out to the property the following morning before the desert heat became unbearable. At sunrise, the town of Red Mesa looked washed in pale gold light, quiet except for the distant rumble of trucks moving along the highway. I followed Walter's dusty pickup along a narrow dirt road that stretched endlessly through open desert. Dry brush rolled across the ground in tangled clusters, while red cliffs rose in the distance beneath an enormous sky. There was something strangely peaceful about it. Empty. Honest. After nearly 40 minutes, Walter slowed near a rusted fence post leaning sideways in the dirt. This is it, he said. I stepped out slowly into warm desert air and stared across the land George left me. 40 acres of silence. The ground looked rough and uneven, scattered with rocks and dry grass that crackled beneath my shoes. No buildings. No roads. Nothing glamorous. The exact kind of place Vanessa would laugh at. But now I noticed things I would have ignored before. Survey stakes driven into the earth. Tire tracks leading toward the northern edge of the property. Small orange ribbons tied to metal markers fluttering in the wind. Walter crouched beside one of the markers and brushed dirt away from the base. State survey crews, he explained. Been out here on and off for months. I looked around slowly while heat waves shimmered above the desert floor. Suddenly the land no longer felt abandoned. It felt watched. Walter pointed toward a distant ridge where several utility trucks sat parked near temporary fencing. That company started buying land quietly 2 years ago, he said. Most locals sold cheap because they thought nothing would ever happen out here. I thought about George making secret trips across the country while everyone else dismissed his obsession with land. Maybe he had sat exactly where I was standing now, imagining a future nobody else could see. The wind lifted my hair gently while I walked farther across the property alone. At the center of the land stood a weathered wooden post with faded initials carved into it. GW. My throat tightened instantly. George had been here more often than I realized. He had marked this place as if it mattered to him long before it mattered to anyone else. I rested my hand against the rough wood and suddenly remembered one strange conversation from years earlier. We had been sitting on our back porch during a thunderstorm while Ryan and Vanessa argued inside about money again. George stared out at the rain for a long time before quietly saying, "Sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to leave them something nobody else wants." At the time, I thought he was talking about old family keepsakes. Now I understood differently. My phone rang suddenly, shattering the silence. Ryan. I answered carefully. "Mom," he said immediately. "Vanessa and I are flying to Phoenix tomorrow." I looked out across the desert while my stomach settled into a strange calm. "Why?" "Because this whole thing is getting out of hand," he snapped. "You disappear across the country chasing some land deal without talking to us?" "Without talking to us." As though my life still required permission. "I am standing on your father's property," I said quietly. "And?" Ryan asked impatiently. "And I think your father knew exactly what he was doing." Silence filled the line for a second before Vanessa's voice appeared faintly in the background. Then Ryan lowered his tone. "Mom, listen carefully. If companies are involved, you need professional help. Real legal guidance." Walter glanced toward me from beside the truck, saying nothing. "I already have legal guidance," I replied. Ryan hesitated. "Who?" I smiled faintly at the desert stretching endlessly around me. "Someone your father trusted." Another long silence followed. Then Ryan exhaled sharply. "Vanessa found out neighboring properties are being bought for millions." There it was again. Not concern. Not family. Just numbers. Money finally speaking openly. I closed my eyes briefly beneath the warm Arizona wind. George had seen all of this coming long before I did. I am not selling anything, I said calmly. Ryan sounded stunned. Mom, do you even understand what this could be worth? I looked down at the dry earth beneath my feet. Funny, just days earlier they all insisted it was worthless. I understand enough, I said softly. Then I ended the call while the desert wind carried silence across the land my husband trusted more than people. By the time Ryan and Vanessa arrived in Arizona 2 days later, the desert no longer felt unfamiliar to me. I had spent hours driving the back roads around Red Mesa with Walter, learning which companies had quietly purchased nearby land and which local rumors were turning into expensive realities. Every conversation led back to the same thing. Lithium. Expansion. Billions of dollars flowing slowly toward places people once ignored. George had seen it years ahead of everyone else. That realization stayed with me constantly now, softening some of the grief I carried. He had not left me behind. He had been planning for me all along. Walter introduced me to Daniel Mercer that morning in Phoenix. Daniel's office overlooked downtown glass towers shimmering beneath brutal desert sunlight. But inside, everything smelled like old books and coffee. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, with silver beginning at his temples and the calm voice of someone who listened more than he spoke. He studied George's paperwork carefully for nearly an hour before finally leaning back in his chair. Mrs. Whitmore, he said quietly, your husband was extremely thorough. He slid another folder across the desk toward me. Inside were legal documents signed nearly 4 years earlier. Trust agreements, mineral rights protections, transfer restrictions. I stared at the pages while my heartbeat slowed into disbelief. George created a protected trust tied directly to the property, Daniel explained. No sale can happen without your direct approval, and no future spouse or family member can override your ownership. I looked down at George's signature near the bottom of the final page. Strong, precise, familiar. Daniel folded his hands together carefully. To be blunt, your husband anticipated pressure from your family after his death. The sentence hurt more than I expected, even though I already knew it was true. Around noon, Ryan and Vanessa arrived at the office unannounced. I saw them through the glass doors before they saw me. Vanessa wore oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored designer dress, completely unsuited for Arizona heat. Ryan looked tired and irritated, his expression tight the moment he spotted Walter sitting beside me in the waiting area. Vanessa's entire face changed when she realized I was not alone anymore. Helen, she said quickly, forcing warmth into her voice. We have been so worried. I noticed she did not ask how I was feeling. She looked directly at the folders on the table instead. Ryan stepped closer. Mom, what is going on? Daniel stood calmly and introduced himself before either of them could continue. The moment Vanessa heard the words land and mineral rights attorney, her posture shifted almost invisibly. More alert, more careful. We are family, she said smoothly. We are only here to help Helen make smart decisions. Daniel gave a polite nod that revealed absolutely nothing. Mrs. Whitmore is fully capable of making her own decisions. Vanessa smiled, but tension flickered beneath it. Of course she is. We just thought maybe she was overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. Funny word. I remembered sitting alone at my kitchen table after George's funeral while Vanessa discussed retirement homes as though my life had already ended too. Back then, they thought grief would make me weak. Easier to move aside. Ryan finally sat across from me and lowered his voice. Mom, companies are offering millions for land around here. His eyes searched mine carefully now, almost nervously. Why did Dad never tell us? I looked at him quietly for a long moment before answering. Maybe because he knew exactly what would happen if he did. The room fell silent after that. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. That is unfair. I almost laughed at the word. Unfair. Like mocking a widow during a will reading was somehow kindness. Daniel opened one of the folders and slid several documents toward me. There is one more thing your husband requested, he said softly. Inside the folder sat a handwritten letter from George dated 8 months before his death. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. Helen, if you are reading this, it means I was right about them. I closed my eyes briefly while the room around me disappeared into silence. George knew. He knew everything. The letter shook slightly in my hands while the room around me disappeared into silence. Even Ryan stopped speaking. George's handwriting stretched carefully across the page in dark blue ink. steady despite the illness that had already begun weakening him by then. Helen, if you are reading this, it means I was right about them. I told myself for years that Ryan would eventually see people clearly. I hoped love would make him wiser instead of weaker. But hope is not the same thing as truth. I swallowed hard and kept reading while the Arizona sunlight spilled quietly across Daniel's office floor. I bought that land because I knew what it would become someday. But more importantly, I bought it because it was the one thing nobody in our family wanted. That meant it had a chance of staying yours. My chest tightened painfully. Across the room, Vanessa shifted in her chair, her expression tightening more with every sentence. George continued, I watched the way they spoke to you when they thought I was not paying attention. I noticed how quickly kindness disappeared whenever money entered the conversation. I am sorry I did not protect you sooner. The room remained perfectly still except for the faint hum of air conditioning overhead. For the first time since George died, I understood something clearly. He had not left me behind with scraps. He had spent years building a way out for me. I lowered the letter slowly and looked at Ryan. His face had gone pale. Dad thought we were using you, he asked quietly. Daniel answered before I could. Your father documented repeated concerns regarding financial pressure and coercion. Vanessa sat forward sharply. That is ridiculous. Her voice cracked slightly beneath the polished calm she always tried to maintain. We cared about Helen. I almost smiled at the sentence because suddenly it sounded so small compared to everything George had seen. Daniel calmly opened another folder. Mrs. Whitmore's property has already received preliminary purchase inquiries exceeding $18 million. Ryan stared at him in disbelief. Vanessa stopped breathing for a second. 18 million. The number floated through the room like something unreal. Just days earlier she had mocked me for inheriting dirt. Now her entire body sat rigid with calculation. That cannot be right, Ryan whispered. Daniel slid the paperwork toward him. It is likely worth considerably more over time. Silence swallowed the room again. I watched my son carefully then. Not the little boy I raised. Not the teenager who once held my hand crossing parking lots. A grown man finally realizing his father trusted strangers in Arizona more than his own family. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. Helen, she said softly, leaning closer. Nobody wants conflict here. We are family. We can manage this together. Together again. Funny how that word only appeared once millions entered the conversation. I folded George's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I looked directly at her for the first time since arriving in Arizona. No, I said quietly. The word landed gently, but it changed everything in the room. Vanessa blinked. Excuse me. George already managed it, I replied. He finished planning long before any of us sat in this office. Ryan rubbed both hands over his face slowly. Mom, I stopped him softly. Your father spent years trying to protect me from becoming dependent on people who only valued me when money was involved. Ryan looked down immediately because somewhere deep inside, he knew exactly why those words hurt. A week later, I stood once more on the Arizona property beneath a sky so wide it barely seemed real. Daniel finalized the trust revisions that morning. Most of the land would remain protected. A small portion would be leased carefully over time, enough to provide more money than I could spend in the years I had left. But the rest would stay untouched exactly as George intended. Walter stood beside me while desert wind rolled softly across the dry earth. What are you going to do now? He asked. I looked across the land glowing gold beneath the setting sun. For the first time in years, the future did not feel frightening. It felt open, peaceful, mine. I think, I said quietly, I am finally going to live the life George tried to give me. Back in Ohio, Ryan called more often after that. His voice always sounded careful now, uncertain in ways I had never heard before. Vanessa stopped calling entirely once she realized there would be no control, no shortcuts, no easy access to what she once mocked. Strange how quickly people lose interest in you once they realize they cannot own any part of your future. Sometimes I still think about that afternoon in the lawyer's office when everyone laughed about worthless desert dirt. They saw emptiness. George saw freedom. And in the end, he was the only one who truly understood what I needed after he was gone.